All right, shalom, shalom, family. I'm going to say the Lord's Prayer. I'm just going to do an early start. I'm just going to talk about some random sources so that when brothers pop up and just see what's going on, it's just random source talk. All right. So we're going to say the Lord's Prayer. Our Father in heaven, honored be thy name. May thy kingdom come. May thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us each day our daily bread, and forgive us of our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us on a righteous path, and guard us from the evil one. In your name we pray. Amen. Amen, amen. All right, so I'm just going to do a little quick introduction. So a lot of people heard about, many of the famous trades, the famous slave trades and everything. We know that many people been through a lot of slave trades and stuff like that. But one of the most interesting slave trades of all time is the chattel slavery, right? The introduction of chattel slavery that happened within the Middle. Now, that brought forth a lot of different controversies in time. So I'm going to read something: the surprising Jewish history of St. Thomas, Virgin Islands. Now, it's going to be kind of interesting, kind of get into this. So, again, we're just going to just talk a little bit on some sources and some things. So, it's going to be talking to some things of Jews that's going to be found in a very interesting area. So, you can kind of get a look at this area. So, Jews from Denmark first arrived on the white beaches of what is now St. Thomas, U.S. Virgin Islands. All right. So we're talking over there, right? Where it says a tiny speck off the coast of Puerto Rico in the mid 17th century, right? These were descendants of a Jewish population that had fled Spain for other parts of Europe during the Inquisition. St. Thomas, right, afforded them a certain religious, obviously let them allowing them, right, that wasn't always available on the mainland. So that's something that's very interesting. So it's letting them keep their religious practices and everything. So this is very interesting. They got some synagogues there, a couple of different things going on, and they're increasing there and everything. So it's really interesting when we start noticing that some of the Jews were fleeing, moving in different areas, settling in different places and whatnot, and kind of just taking part of things. But what's interesting is we need to also know some of the more ancient history. So I just showed you something from the 1700s, just let us know that some of the Jews were coming to America and were becoming some of the interesting individuals. Well, when we start ancient historical documents, we find some interesting things. And I'm just going to show some things that others also talk about. So let's go and talk about some things real fast. So it's fair use. This is not for profit. It's just for showing information.
Another I wanted to drop, right? Right? Let me get it here. This is the book called the Critical Review of the Annals of Literature. Check this out, Gaja. You can see it there. It's a good fun, right? Mm-hmm. Put it on the screen so you all can see it. Because there was an expulsion during the time of the late 1400s from Spain, right? Where the Jews were being expelled from different parts of Spain. Let's find out who these Jews were. I need y'all to read this real quick. Hold on. It says here. Let me go down the line. Swedes, the Danes, and the Brandenburgers, the North Americans since 1778 with the Spaniards. Their trade, however, still increased, and not only by Swedes and burghers, ceasing their navigations of the coast of Guinea, but from the annals demand a supply of more than 100,000 Negro recruits for their own colonies. The author confines his relation of the first Negro trade to that carried on by the Portuguese and Spaniards. Gonzalo was the first Portuguese in 1942 returned with Negro slaves, purchased instead of the Africans, who had till then been carried off by mere violence. But soon after, the Portuguese, because better acquainted with the Africans and their valuable products, Prince Henry founded the first Guinea company that settled factories in the fortress of Anguin and got the exclusive privilege of trading with the Arabs, Muslims, assalamu alaikum. The trade soon increased to that in 1455. Not less than 700 or 800 Negro slaves were annually exported to Lisbon. At length, the Portuguese. In 1471 discovered the Gold Coast, the Ivory Coast. And ever since, the intercourse between Portugal and Guinea was continued. The Portuguese endeavored to exclude other nations from Guinea, whilst the rest of the European navigators were in spite of papal bulls in all the reports. See that, papal bulls?
Mm-hmm.
And all the reports industriously
the spread of the pretended dangers of that coast, striving to get a share of that profitable gold trade. The discovery of the Gold Coast served indeed yet more to enlarge of the navigation of the Portuguese than theirs, but it forced them also to extend themselves on the coast and to settle colonies in Congo, Angola, and
so they begin to settle. They begin to settle colonies where?
In Congo, Angola, and other places,
read,
which they had till then neglected.
Come on.
Prince Henry's colonies were enlarged by his successors. King John II in 1492 expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas.
Hold up. He expelled all the Jews to what?
To the island of St. Thomas.
To the island of St. Thomas. So the Jews that was expelled out of Spain, folks, a lot of them was taken to St. Thomas. In our history, they're claiming the expulsion of the Jews from Spain were Europeans. They were putting us in slavery. That was us being expelled, actually being expulted. Exactly. Yeah. Come on, finish reading, Elder Lawyer.
It says, King John in 1492 expelled Jews to the island of St. Thomas.
Come on.
Which had been discovered in 1471.
But the whole thing, if the Jews were expelled to St. Thomas, what? So this is their history and their annals. I'm going to be going into more of their annals to track all the way to the Americas. We have it, but I'm going to be going over that in the academy. But finish what you have, Elder Lawyer.
It says, into other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. And from then, or from these banished Jews.
There was what?
It says, and from these banished Jews, the Black Portuguese, as they are called, and the Jews in Longo are the despised even by the very Negroes.
Come on.
And descended.
Go ahead.
By these colonists, St. Thomas soon became a considerable place of trade. And valuable for its sugar plantation. 30 years after their settlement, not less than 150,000 arobes, or 30 pounds of weight each, of sugar were exported. And the engines of 60 sugar works turned by slaves.
Okay, you got it, brother. Hold up. Now here's the point. Oh, yeah, we're going to have this on the streets. Now, this is the whole point, though. The whole point.
Shalom, shalom, family. Shalom, as always, unbiasedly reviewing, right? So I looked into those sources and everything. There's some pretty legit sources. We got to get a little deeper in that to get into what's going on with some of the things in the time that we're in. Genetics and the information behind some of these things is really interesting. I want you to take a look at another piece that someone also illustrated. I kind of want to jump to something here. I think it's really interesting to point out because a lot of information, a lot of the records, they're lingering about, right? They're just lingering about, and I'm just gonna kind of point out here. That's I think on this one is kind of interesting. So I'm just gonna jump to the final part over here and talk about that information. So he kind of goes over what happened in the areas of Spain. So Spain, the events of Spain is one of the most controversial events because not a lot of people know why it's so important. It's whenever you see history when they talk about the slave trade and all that stuff, they usually start about the time of the 1600s, right? They skip. You don't hear a lot about the 1400s or the 1500s. Why is that important? Because in the 1400s, you actually will find out where it all started to begin, and very early on, in fact. Um, that's really important to know, and even like the information of locations like that. The reason why I wanted to go to this is because there's a lot of information for a lot of events to the people of Israel that we have to understand when we're considering the movements of this people, to consider even the early movements, like for example some of the Assyrian movements. So I thought this was an interesting one because it talks about some of those things. Let me just go down and kind of talk about something that I think is kind of interesting. So what's interesting is it points out a certain lineages, right? And there's an important understanding in genetics that's called monophyletic family. And one of the main thing about this lineage is that it's pointing out that this certain lineage is going to be a lineage that connects a couple different lines, Eurasian lines, and lines that would be, what's the word I'm looking for? Some would think would be controversial, pretty controversial. But let me just go to something else real fast and talk about that kind of. So here's just another piece this brother also talked about, and this kind of like is a continuation from what I was talking about. The other one is these two. Why is this important that people should know about this type of history, and why this history is something that is reclaimable because it's truth. Because the
Over the
history that he's
years,
reading here is truth. The reason why is because it goes over the actual historical reports, different takes, different outlooks on historical reports on actual individuals of Spain and Portugal during the exiles and the movements of these individuals. Because once you start looking at the actual word for word reports and you start seeing where the individual is going, right? Because a lot of people, it's almost like it's like they can't even imagine that the people would have been banished into areas and become slaves and increase in a type of chattel slavery, a type of forced slavery that forces a group of people that are fairly similar to basically develop and feed their slave trade, right? So chattel slavery is a very important thing to understand and everything. But these two are interesting and important. So I'm gonna put them in the description afterwards for anyone that hasn't seen it and wants to get a little understanding on like some of the actual historical reports and stuff. I think these two is gonna be great for understanding what I'm saying here. So there's an ancient family in the Portugal, right? And they actually become the Negro. Now, what's interesting, if you notice from that reading that person was reading earlier, right? Now, I don't agree with all their teaching, just so that I can make that clear. But I do believe that have truth or historical records. It doesn't matter who read them, as long as we just get the good of what's going on in history with the all the pieces, right? And what's interesting about this is that early on, you'll notice there's a difference that's starting to be made during a certain um, slave trades that's happening, and there's a talk of the African slaves, and in fact, this exact book, I spoke of this yesterday, right? We actually spoke of this in some detail to go over how it is a book that's documenting the events that are happening around pretty much the 1400s to the 1700s, and is getting a little insight on some events and even some earlier events. But what it talks about is something really interesting on how it makes a difference between the groups that are called Africans and the groups that are called Negroes. Now, the reason why that's important is because this is why we kept speaking about this, that there are groups that would be in areas of Africa that would have been replaced by the Bronze Age movements of the Negro groups that actually would have those E groups that started to replace some of those A and B groups that were the original Africans. But you can see right here, as it says, right, one individual returned with Negro slaves purchased instead of Africans. So it's quite interesting when you think of that, when you hear that. And what that's saying is actually giving an important understanding about these Jews, right? About these Negro Jews, right? And it's going to let you know who it's comparing to. So you'll start to see in history, it'll start to compare them to Negroes, right? Because actually the Negroes, they become a major group. And also from the understanding of these Negroes, they also started to develop in areas of Africa, but early on they started to have a name, right? A lot of people know the story of Yahya, right? Or the individual in the areas of Lisbon, right, amongst the Jews, right, that had received the honorable name, right? Long story short, right? This is why it's important, because I was just showing earlier how I was having a conversation with T Jump, and I know a lot of individuals don't know what Moors are, right? There's a lot of history that we know, that I like to speak to individuals that know a lot of stuff so that more of it can come out. So more questions, more information provided. So here's a little something that's interesting, right? After the conquest, pretty much one of the kings of the land, right, with two country houses that had belonged to the Moors. So you can understand that some of the Moors were assisting with the Jews, wherefore he assumed the name Negro, because that's important, is that early on the Moors, right? The Moors that trace all the way back, you trace them all the way back, like we showed with some ancient historical records, right? Let's talk about some ancient historical records real fast, right? That's why on our channel we go over a lot of historical. Sometimes, after over a major deep topic, sometimes that may be just somewhere deep, right? It might end up being deep on a playlist, where we can see over here. Here's these playlists right here. And if we go to the full playlist, right? I'm just gonna go to this here. All right. And I'm just going to go to it, and I'm gonna go to something here. So as you can see, there's a lot of different talks, but we had a talk about certain lineages. So a lot of people, these things go over their head when they're still on. We know that the Arabians all the way to the far area of. Right, if you never heard this conversation on the Arabians, the Israelites, and all those things, there's a lot of important information that's important to know. But let me actually point out something about the Moors. So we go over the exact information of who the Moors are, their pin rising up and everything, and have connections to when you think of the Moors or Muslimans and whatnot. We got from one of the writings of the history of the Moors of Spain. It says the announcement of a religion which had been preached by a said descendant of Ishmael, whom the Moors regarded as their father. The rapid conquest of the Muslimans who were already masters of half of Asia and a large portion of Africa, and who threatened to enslave the world, right? Arouse the excitable, I did obviously the imaginations of the Moors. So they basically started to get the Moors excited because they were hearing about this uprising, right? That was rising up, and restored to their national character all its passionate energy, right? So that's important to get a little bit understanding that that's going to be one piece of a few other pieces that we have went over in this exact video. Now, one of the most interesting things about it is that we have spoke early on how the early Jews and the early ones of Muhammad were fighting each other and going at it at the Battle of the Foss, and that was in 627 AD. And we were expressing how they had wrote, right, in the 1,000 years of Jewish history from the days of Alexander the Great to the Muslim conquest of Spain, right? Because they're going to go into Spain, and that's where we're going to get Yahya the Negro and different things like that. That's going to be kind of interesting and kind of important to get understanding of. Is that once we get the events that happen in Arabia, they go and they spread into different areas of Africa. They move with the Muslims. Some of them move with the Muslims. Some convert. Not all of them convert, but some of them stay to their belief, and they keep moving to better places because they lose Arabia, and they're going down into Yemen, into Abyssinia, and trying to escape the conquest that's happening there. And the Muslims start to, if you know, right around the Arab slave trade, they start to reach more deeper against those Negroes that's trying to flee them. So that's kind of important to know about in that conquest, right? Throughout all those things. That's why there's writings that says, right, these lands of settlement in the first and second century before the Christian era outside Palestine, or you say Canaan and whatnot, are called the Dispersia, right? So they say places outside of Israel is called Dispersia. So if the people are outside of Israel, they're in a Dispersia. It says, and in fact, this is what it says: the land that next to Judea contained the largest number of Jews was Egypt. So that's important to know about how the Muslims pushed the Jews out of Arabia and Egypt. So it's important to know that the Muslims first went up to Persia, right, locking off that upper area, and then they swept back down, pushing and taking over Arabia and pushing the Jews out. So that's important to understand. But when they went up to Arabia, they made different allegiances. That's important to know for the Seljuk Turk rising up, how the later Turks became religious, and Ottoman Turks were pretty much just the same Seljuk Turks, just religious group of Turks of one dynasty. So, which traces all the way back to the Gog Turks, which is important family to know. But this is something that's important to know about, because when putting all those pieces together, you'll start to understand a very important picture. So it just talks about obviously some of the obviously the growth of that family, the Jews. Obviously, they was developing, increasing, right, becoming large and increasing in different areas, right. There's some information on here that is here, but some information that is not going to be here. But it just talks about different individuals in the early Middle Ages of Jews that had lived in different areas of the land. So we know that there was recordings of Jews all around those areas, just to kind of make that establish that when we're reading these records, we know that these things are true, that there were Jews around those areas. And these will be also in connection to early Jews that had moved because of the falls of the land, right? So just to kind of bring that to the understanding, yes, these names of these groups and stuff is also known, is that we can actually go over those things and whatnot. So it's something when going over. So I'm just going to put these kind of like little highlights that are simple but complex and great to know. Well, I'll show this quick little piece.
Africa. And time to look up the word Negro in the Webster Dictionary? Well, let's take a closer look. The Webster Dictionary defines the word Negro as, and I quote, a member of a race of humankind native to Africa, and classified according to physical features such as dark skin pigmentation. This is what we would expect to find for the definition of the word Negro. However, very few people scroll down to read the section located near the bottom of the page, which reads, First known use of Negro, 1555, in the meaning defined above. In other words, the first written record of the word Negro, meaning an African, started in the year 1555. In other words, the word Negro did not refer to a person of African descent until the year 1555. And with that in mind, the question would be, then who were the people called Negroes before 1555? You see, the transatlantic slave trade started in the year 1501. And the slaves on the first transatlantic slave ships were called Negroes. In fact, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel of Spain made it mandatory that only Negroes who were born in Spain and Portugal would be allowed to go to the Americas as slaves. In other words, these Negroes were Spanish and Portuguese natives. And so we need to know who was called Negroes in Spain and Portugal before 1555. Now, in 1492, we see the Spanish Jews who fled into Portugal after being expelled from Spain. We see these Jews were called Negroes. As the following reference reads, and it reads, King John II in 1492 expelled all the Jews to the island of St. Thomas, which had been discovered in 1471, and to other Portuguese settlements on the continent of Africa. And from these banished Jews, the Black Portuguese, or the Negro Portuguese, as they are called, and the Jews in Luango. Not only were these Spanish and Portuguese Jews called Negroes, they also took on the last name of Negro. For example, we see Jews in Portugal with the names Yaya Negro, or Judah Negro, and Dawid or David Negro. In addition to being called Negro and having last names of Negro, these Jews were described as black, dark complexion, brown, and swarthy in color. Some references compare the color of these Jews to the Bicaris of Africa, who look like the so-called Negroes today. We also see the skulls of the Spanish Jews identified as dolichocephalic, of the so-called. Finally, when these black Jews got sick, they called it the Black Plague. When these black Jews persecuted by the Inquisition Book of Laws was called the Black Book. And when the Spaniards denied the persecution of these black people, they referred to the persecution as a black legend. In other words, we see black, 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 and black when referring to these Jews. In fact, these Jews were called black for hundreds of years, and it wasn't referred to as being anti-Semitic. You see, anti-Semitic is a term that didn't come into existence until the late 1800s. So the question would be, how can someone be anti-Semitic by calling a Jew black, when the Brews had last names of Negro? Think about it.
That's a great question. What is YAP? What is YAP? Right. So what is a YAP haplogroup? So a lot of people talk about these lineages, and they say that we can find exactly who is Israel. And a lot of people say it's the YAP lineage. Now, if you look at YAP, it's really interesting because the YAP lineage demands. When I say it demands privacy, it demands that YAP plus allele demands its separation from its nodes. So it's important to know that A and B and CF P143 is not the same as YAP lineages. So those are three separations right then and there. Right. Nobody can challenge that. Right. We can verify that with an unrooted chart. We can hold that in a scientific grounds. We can verify that logically, monophylactically, right? It's a fact. Lineages is this lineage that, let's go a little bit into, even if you was to, let's show, it'll just show you an easy way. So if you see DE, you can say DE, right? Let's say DE DNA, just to kind of get it, right? We got a haplogroup. So DE haplogroup or Y DNA, right? That would have been something too. And look, let me show you right where it'll tell you about this YAP lineage, right? It'll tell you right here, and I'll show you how we can go into it very easily if you've never seen it on it. So the DE lineage, or this group, the YAP lineage, is important to know about what happened with it. So it has this unique event. So if you know a little bit about it, right, when it's saying unique, it's talking unique, right? It's very unique what happens with this lineage, because it does something that is controversial to science if you know about how things, or how humans evolve and things like that. But what it does is this is a basic of what it just is. It's just going to be a strand of the allele, which let me actually talk about what that is pretty much, of the breakdown of pretty much what is in it, to kind of make it simple, is that it's a pretty much a genetic component that for this lineage copied itself, right? So when it did this, it had to do this very early on. The reason why is because all its descendants from the splitting of the DE lineages, all of them have this copy. Every single one has this copy. So they call it a YAP plus, right? And in fact, they say inserted a copy of itself into the Y chromosome. So that's important to know about the allele, is that it had a copy of itself into the Y chromosome. Hence, all Y chromosomes belong to DE, D, and E, and their subclades are YAP positive. So that's important to know that all the groups of DE are YAP positive. But notice, of all the other ones, all Y chromosomes that belong to other haplogroups and subclades are YAP negative. That's important. So that's gonna be very key to understand about this little fact here. So there's a lot of ways of going to it. You can copy it, and if you search it, into some of the breakdowns of it, there's a lot of different breakdowns of that. It's kind of interesting to go into those things and whatnot. But that's a simple way to summarize that, so it's not being overwhelming. It's a haplogroup that typically copied itself. And it makes it important to know about the DE groups, because a lot of people ignore that. And if you ignore that, you can twist the information however you want, and it's gonna be, no one's gonna take you serious. No one's gonna take anyone serious that's twisting information. Things that are not monophylactic, and you bring that to a geneticist, he's gonna look at you like you don't, obviously don't, you didn't even Google to learn about how these nodes and click. That's what they're gonna say. We know it's work. We got a better. So knowing about that separation of A and B versus D and E and CF, right? Because remember, A and B doesn't make CT, but DE and CF are under CT. So if A and B doesn't actually make CT, when we had went over it before, the out of Africa concept, when we went over the papers, right? Reconstruction of out of Africa not having enough proof, right? We got enough genetic papers that actually went over the actual mutation and shows that actually some of those lineages that I and R, they actually don't have early genetic mutations that would link them to those A and B groups. That some A and B groups that like A1A or A1B don't have ties to like groups with groups like A00, which is totally different than A1B and A1A. So for those that understand that, you understand what I'm saying. A00 is a different SNP, which is traceable with ancient humanoids, like ancient Neanderthal, ancient Denisovan, which is the A with 4 zeros, and for Denisovan, and A with 3 zeros with Neanderthal. And that's just important for the Neolithic bottleneck, for the fact how we don't have any of those ancient humans anymore. So those archaic humans that existed before, all wiped out, right? If you put those on a chart to look those work, and you put that side to side with a lineage from Adam, Cain's line to Seth's line survived. Interesting what you're looking at there when you're looking at the nodes side by side. But let me go to something here to kind of point something out, right? We go over a lot of interesting things, and I say this without a doubt from all the studies seen. The haplogroup of the Israelites is E1B1A. If someone ever thinks it's not, they have to look at the ancient finds. They have to look at the ancient to see if it's actually in a culture. Not a hypothetical or a likely, right? Because there's a lot of hypotheticals and likelies that people will look at and not consider the lineage because it may be large in the area now, as we see with some of the events with chattel slavery. I wonder if they were doing chattel slavery for a couple hundred years, could the people grow very massive? Probably could, especially if some escape. Very, very important to know that. And some of them still were Jews from different areas that would have started from the ones who had started the slave trade, which were the Portuguese and everything. So very, very important when we go over that, when we talk about that information. So we had talked about that yesterday. About that information yesterday. But there's a couple other things that I think is important that I wanted to take this day to kind of go over. And if you have any questions, definitely throw them out there, or any curiosity or anything, we can talk about those things. Because we're just going to talk about some things that we have about hours and hours that we're going to speak about them real quick. So here's a map. This map is important because we can demonstrate this by fossils and ancient humanoids. So we're talking fossils, talking ancient humanoids like Natufians and Jomon, ancient individuals from Japan, right? Ancient D groups from Japan, right? That would trace all the way to Syria, that would have had evidence of moving into Africa because of how D and E splits that Yap lineage, and how they become the Natufian groups, early groups that start to pop up and spread and increase later in the pre-pottery Neolithic B cultures of those E groups that start to spread throughout these areas. And then they start to become a private lineage that pops up in the Bronze Age, which is going to be in the Bronze Age, transition to the Iron Age, is going to be that E1B1A. That group pops up right in the lands. We find them as early as the Exodus, right? Right in the lands of Egypt. And then later on after that, that E1B1A1 line. So be careful with those E1B1 because that's V38, E1B1A, V38. But the descendants that will become Israelites will be those E1B1A8 and E1B1A7. Those ones start to, as Israelites, for some reason, throughout all history, kept on fleeing into Egypt, going into Nubia, which was a Semitic culture, right? In between another Semitic culture of the groups in Punt, Abyssinia, right? When we talked about the Jotanites going down through the areas of Yemen, down into areas of Abyssinia, and increasing in areas of Africa, conquering the areas with Iron Age culture from Egypt. As Egypt constantly getting more and more African lineages there. And what do we mean by it got more? Right? Because remember, one of the major things that I find important in life is not to talk. Right? They just have a lot to say. They have a lot to think about and a lot of things they want. And I don't think the information should come from a theory. I don't think the theory should just come out of a lack of information. The information is so we need to look at information, evaluate the information, then you can make theories and all that. But then it has to be cross-examined with all that. So I want to kind of show something that I think is kind of interesting, because when we think of the movements of people, and we notice something kind of interesting. So first, let's understand this little picture right here is that we're talking about this line, just like if we connect it to a Eurasian Jomon or Yomon people that split at that DE lineage, right? We're talking not modern Nigerians, ancient DE groups that went to and are found in Japanese people today. That's very important. So D groups found in Japanese. We did a major study on that. But let's keep on talking a little bit on this, because this is kind of interesting, because when we think about what happened in the land, the biblical talks about how the Israelites and Shemites were basically replacing what were described as like ancient humanoids and stuff. It's kind of interesting. It's kind of like talking about a remnant of giants and stuff. So it goes over some of the things that starts to happen after the changes of the Neolithic time. So that's some interesting stuff to think about, right? Was one of the individuals having some ancient, maybe mtDNA in them, and it starts to affect some of the later descendants, right? Maybe some ancient PCA that's mixed in, right? But we noticed something early on after the Neolithic movements is that we start to see some of those Semitic groups kind of settled in the areas, as we can see right here, groups that we call Natufians, genetic connections to groups like Africa, like the Iberasians. So the Iberasians and the Natufians are related with those E groups. And they have connections even with some of the groups that go into areas like we was talking about of the corners of Africa. So they're connecting these areas, and all we can confirm to be Eurasian. So every one of these we can confirm to be Eurasian. If someone's curious on how Mota is Eurasian and how the Iberasians are Eurasian, we can show that very easily, as we got geneticists that will tell you about Mota. As you can see, is younger than the Natufian. They actually have a Eurasian back migration, and the Iberasians, which seems like they're older than the Natufian. Actually, we recently found fossils of Natufian that were older than the Iberasians. So that's very important to know in Syria and areas of near areas of Anatolia and stuff. So that's going to be kind of important to take a note of. But also it's important to know about the Iberasians mtDNA Eurasian mixtures that they had most likely from these individuals from these mountains over here. So that's important to know about their mtDNA mixtures, early on mtDNA mixtures. It's only later on they start mixing with those L lineages, which have very close genetic ties to them, right? Which also biblical narrative talks about that happens, right? Now, what was also interesting is if we start to the languages, interesting thing when we start to notice what, right? Something kind of interesting when we start to think about where these languages, think about some of the Afro-Asiatic languages, right? We start to notice something fairly interesting. We start to notice, as you can see right here, the South Semitic, right, are going to be in connection with obviously areas of Arabia and areas of corners of Africa. Now, what's interesting is Africa is actually a very rich area It has a lot of rich resources. So it's not something that if someone sees, they'll see it not something that is habitable, right? Because any person that's walking in the world, if something is habitable, if something is profitable, it's something that they can use, right? So they're not worried about anybody judging them 2,000 or any thousands of years later, saying, "Oh, you're Africans." No one cares, right? Let's get that money. So they're trying to get what they need for the trades that they're in. So that's important because we actually had connect these trades early on for some of those movements of those Semitic groups. But they start noticing Africa had more and more riches in it. But that doesn't mean that made in Africa. But the reason why that's important, we're talking about groups that will be connecting groups such as the Akkadians and other groups, the Middle East. Ultimately, the homeland of Afro-Asiatic, they say, is Africa and most probably Ethiopia and stuff like that. So they go into those things and everything and say, "Oh, it's all connected and everything," and that's all important because we know that Jotin and the Cushites were kind of moving together and moving into these little areas. That's why you start to see groups like the Cushites. That's important to note that the Cushites are a little different than groups like the Omic groups, which are Semitic groups. So Cushites are also Semitic, but the Omic groups will be more of that closer Southern Semitic, which will be closer to the Hebrew, which we had spoke about before. It's very important. And because they had some early ties to upper coastal. We spoke about different groups that had a mixture of those Tufians in them. All right. So let's just talk about some interesting things that I'm just going to jump down and kind of talk about real fast that I think is kind of interesting to look at. Just going to jump a little further down. So this was something I had talked about before when I talked about the family ties of Urkesh and things like that, and Assyria connecting with Earth and stuff like that, right? When we look at the human mobility and basically Alika, right, during the second millennium BC, right? Just going to talk about some of the movements that were happening there, right? And they find a lot of individuals, right? They find some interesting individuals and they go over some family ties and different things like that. Now, what was interesting about that, how we have found some of the groups that we had connected with Syrians and Akkadians that we have found out that were Semitic had ties to some of the groups that we have found later, just like in some of the movements of those Negroes having E1B1A, which we also found in many Jewish populations. And we found some of those E1 groups there. So that wide lineage being there shows its interesting movements that whenever we see a lot of times when a lot of these lineages are glossed over, they'll say, "Oh, it's only African. That's it. End of story." Right. But the interesting thing is they start to kind of lean towards more this biblical culture that is very linked to the Middle East and areas of where we would see the Semitic cultures, which we have spoken about in its ancient, because it's very interesting to get a look in. And we have this confirmation from geneticists themselves. So a lot of brothers are putting this out to let people know that geneticists are confirming these things. So it's not something that should be controversial that, a lot of these Jews are just Negroes. It shouldn't be controversial. It should just be, hey, the world was racist at a point in time. It is what it is, right? There was a chattel slavery, and this group became one with this group, and a lot of people wouldn't believe it, even if you had showed them the evidence yourself, especially the generations that are hardhead, right? But genetics talk, so sources talk.
There are groups that make claim for E1B1A being a founding haplogroup among Semitic groups. Is E1B1A found in high frequencies among Semitic populations like J1? Would the ancient Arabians and Syrians and Israelites have had percentages of E1B1A within their populations in antiquity?
Yeah, they did. but they also had J1. So this is my opinion. So take that for what it is. I think that J1 and J2 probably were not, and I'm going to say Afroasiatic because, like the Egyptians spoke non-Semitic language, but it was Afroasiatic, more closely related to that of the Amazigh people, the Berbers, right? So North Africa had a different branch before the Semitic, whatever. So I'll say Afroasiatic, Semitic, and whatever the other groups like Tuareg and stuff. So it looks like the Natufians had it. It looks like there was a massive admixture between Western and Eastern Levant, Middle Eastern people, probably before 3000 BC, but after, let's say after like 8000 BC, somewhere like in prehistory, there was a genetic exchange, and the J's, J1, J2, seem to show up during that exchange in the Levant and the western part of the Middle East. I don't think Afroasiatic languages are from Western Iran, which is where they would come from. Therefore, I don't think. Also, like you find J2 and J's in Europe and obviously, and that's not due to Semitic, right? So they're ancient lineages that are in like the Indus Valley civilization and what. Excuse me. So I think E is probably more likely to be Afroasiatic, and they had high frequencies in Arabian, Syrians, and Israelites. And they had high frequencies in Arabian Israelites.
So again, geneticists are confirming these things, and how and what and why are they confirming these things? What's an interesting thing that we early on, right? Here's a if you know anyone who knows genetics and believe that E1B1A could be the exact Israelite line that pops up after the Neolithic, let them know this, right? E1 haplogroups are actually found in Africa, right? For example, Morocco Neolithic, before we even find any Bronze Age E1B1As, right? Who even link to those E1B1 of Natufians. And as we know, if they want to like talk about R1 E1B1B groups and how they're Semitic and whatnot, and some want to say, oh, they're only African. Well, R1B, which they say are European, well, R1B actually was replaced by E1B1B, right? By the said scientific scale only after 14,000 BC or years before present, whatnot. And we're talking major years when we're talking those years. So we're talking fossils on a scientific scale, right? So this is for those that are young Earth creationists. They're probably like, "What are you talking about?" But for those that are scientists, they're like, "Oh well, yeah, okay." We talk that too. So just to kind of make it understood that we can make it make sense. The reason why is because we know that again, T was in Africa before E1B1A, and R1B was in Africa before E1B1B, and that's an important thing to know about that because a lot of those lines, if you looked at them today, you'll be surprised where they were a long time ago, right? Because they have some interesting movements, some very interesting movements. I would say very very interesting movements. I would say, you know. But let me pull something up because I want to show one more piece that I think is kind of important. In fact, so on this, let me just show this last piece that I think is important to note because it tells us a major thing to know. All right, so right, remember we was talking about Egypt, right? We talk about Egypt and how, again, in the areas of Egypt they start getting darker skin, right? It's because those groups, those Neolithic groups, move deeper into Africa, right? Africa starts to become conquered by an Iron Age culture. And that's what the interesting thing is when you start looking at the Bantu groups. Be careful looking at those Bantu groups. That haplogroup E1B1A only joined groups in the Iron Age. That's important to know about. So time frame in these events are important at times. But let me point out something that I think is kind of interesting from a study. So first, let me show this because I think this is important to know. Most people see. I'm gonna show these. Let me read it as it goes, because this is actually really interesting. All right. I think that little sound is nice too. So it's going to about some from some Bibles, are really written Bibles. Why is this important? Because remember all that stuff we talked about Negroes early on? It's going to tell us something about the major difference between the of Ham and those groups that were close. So obviously of Ham, right? A son of Noah, right? Father of Cush, like we've seen with the Cushites and all that, and of Egypt and of Canaan. It says, so see further on these ones, but it says, while they may, watch what it says here, while they may have all been dark skinned, they were not, this was important, they were not, right? Very important. The forefathers of the Noid races, but rather of people associated with Egypt, right? So you see what's going on there in the basically north of the continent of Africa. So that's important. So you know the Hamites were in the north of the continent of Africa. The Egyptians, right? So you just see what they talk about. Obviously they was in those areas in those upper times. So upper areas of Africa actually had a lot of Hamites early on. But a lot of those E groups actually kept pushing through Africa. They settled deeper in there. Those Negroid groups, the Negroes, started to settle down there. So that's important to understand that Shem and Ham have some similarities to them. They look fairly similar, actually, in their origins, until later mixes with some of the stronger European nations that came down, that conquered a lot of those groups. Right? That's important to know about that. That's something that did happen. Actually, in the Israelite, right? The seed, right? That was an Indo that came down there. But we got to note the difference between the Canaanite sea peoples and the Israelites, and also the ancient Canaanites. So there's a little battle there. So you see what it's constantly saying, right? Ham, right? Talks about the youngest son of Noah, probably just talks about how old he learned the flood, but it says right here, he became the progenitor of the dark races, not the Negroes, right? But the Egyptians, Ethiopians, Libyans, and Canaanites and whatnot. But the Negro groups that started to go into areas of, and look, we can note that from the DE group. Notice something interesting about that I just said about the E group, right? Directly. We'll notice something that's said interesting about the E group directly if we go a little deeper into it, right? Let's go just a little deeper into the lineage, to the one that pops up under P, which is from the Natufians, and V38, which makes Mota, but 2, which are the ones that are found in the B culture, right? Very important. That's going to be Eurasia, BMAC culture. So we're talking coming out of the blue. But notice something about this lineage, what it says about this lineage that we kept talking about that's important to know about its areas. It says about this lineage. It says it was replacing another lineage, right? So E1B1A became a new dominant, a now dominant lineage in Africa. But it says earlier traces, right? Traces of earlier inhabitants, however, can be observed today in these regions via the presence of the Y DNA haplogroups of and B haplogroups. So the earliest lineages in Africa was A and haplogroups. But what were the groups that we've seen start to conquer the areas of Africa in the Iron Age? What were the groups that we've seen to conquer the areas of Africa in the Iron Age? They were the E1B1A groups that had picked up the iron from Egypt. And that's important because the iron advancements started in Egypt. And that's where many of the other places have picked it up. That's why you constantly see this Iron Age culture constantly in different areas, right? So they see a lot of that in different areas. But notice you'll never see anything like a Neolithic culture of this group in Africa. Why? Because it was not in Africa in the Neolithic time frame. That's very important. you got to be careful if you find any papers on that, to go about that paper very closely, right? For example, some of the sayings of that the group was in when Africa was drying, there's no actual fossil of it, but it was concluded because it was largely in that area, but it was not a fossil found in the cultures that were there. So that's something that's important to know about. For example, you can see right here in this one, right? This one just says a little bit about saying that they would say that they, right here where they talk about this sickle and everything, and they say there was a sickle in the areas of Cameroon. But we also got a study on Cameroon that tells us that the groups of those E1B1A groups, or those said groups that became Bantu, wasn't in the areas of Cameroon 3000 BC, because they found fossils of what were there, or groups that were there, right? Ancient humanoids that were there. But we know that this one right here is actually just talking about, again, just these ancient sickles and stuff there that says may have first arose the ancestors of modern Africans. So it's may, but not actually is. So you got to be careful. Even when you look at this study, that's not even a haplogroup on a lot of these studies. So remember, Wikipedia is a secondary source. So don't ever use Wikipedia like it's just going to be a first primary source, right? It's encyclopedia. It's a encyclopedia. So Wikipedia is a encyclopedia of primary sources. So you can look at the source directly. This little thing is not talking about X, right? So don't look at those papers and misunderstand. Having this conversation with many people and offering many people to prove me wrong that E1B1A wouldn't be the Israelites, but that has not been done, because you got to understand how papers work, how these papers and how we know we're getting actual verifiable information versus hypothetical information. So hypothetical information is not the same as a culture, a fossilized culture or ancient culture, right? So that's going to be very important to know about lineages. So it's going to be this culture up at this change of the Bronze Age, M2, that becomes the dominance that leaves areas of Arabia as the Israelites are there. They're developing it in the areas of Africa, right in the areas of places of Egypt. They go up, some even go back down into Africa, and then they even scatter into some different areas of Africa. That's something that happens very early on because they just are rebellious at times, and they go back down into Egypt and go deeper into Africa. It's just something. They're known as the people group, or the people's expansion, right? So they're a group of people that expand down there. But you got to also be aware that they move with R1 lineages. So you can note that these R1 lineages will be amongst them. That's important because if we consider who are R1 lineages, they're said to be lineages of Eurasia. So there's no doubt that the E groups had some ties with groups of Eurasia. So that's going to be very important to understand that as this group moves around, they're going to be moving around with these other groups. Most likely ties around Egypt, because those the R1 lineage, R1B directly was in Egypt. And also we know that one of the earliest E1B1A groups were found in the areas of Egypt. So that's going to be very important to know, because we know that that's where the Israelites developed, around areas of Egypt and Levant, which we also know these groups were in areas of Egypt and Levant. And we also know these groups were part of the slave trade. So that's important, the Negroes that were taken in the slave trade. So that's going to be very important to understand, right? So if someone has a question on these things, they got to ask those questions. So be careful on those most probably and stuff like that, and things like that. See that possibly, right? That possibly doesn't mean that they found a fossil of it, so, or found an ancient find, right? So possiblies and stuff like that. So that's why Wikipedia, you want to be careful on those that's running around with Wiki sources saying that, oh, it's in Africa, where, right? That's going to be one of those conclusions that's important to note. They're basically trying to connect people to A and B groups that don't connect to Yap lineages, right? That's why all that's important, that breakdown. But let's see, questions. Amen. That's right, family. We gotta bring it out. Definitely gotta bring it out. What was the D0 group? Well, let's look at that. Right? It was just a group from those ancient deeds of those Japanese groups, from the Assyrians. Some of them are recently found, and it's not a tribe. It was only 3 finds. So that's important to understand that those 3 Nigerians that only 3 Nigerians that they found also traced to Syria and areas of Japan. So that's going to be very important. So you're probably talking about those 3 Nigerians right here, right? As it says, when they talk about these 3 Nigerians, right? Which you're probably talking about that D0 that's found. It's not a tribe, but it was 3 Nigerians, but they also found 2 in this area on the west coast of Saudi Arabia. So they also found that lineage, which is D0 is D2. So that's important. So D2 was also found here. So you see what's going on right here? So they were found right here. So that D lineage, what tribe is it? It's a tribe that came from Arabia. That's what it is. It's a D lineage that split and came from the areas of Arabia, and some went into Africa. That's what it is. And a lot of them are Eurasian continents, because if we go deeper into D group, as you can see right there, they're from Eurasia. So they have a lot of lineages that go into areas of Eurasia. That's very important when you look fossils or the ancient finds of them, right? Very, very important. Very, 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 very important to look at that. So that's probably what you would talk about, right? When they talk about that D0 and everything with those Nigerians, right? That was in 2019, right? They obviously found more of them, right? It was just a nation other than D1, because D1 is obviously Japanese, right? D1 is obviously Japanese, but they know that the D0 group, they know, as it says right here, if we want to go a little bit into it, it lets you know soon after the said 70,000 to 55,000 year ago migration, they say from Africa of Basal D and other Basal Y lineages, right? They say they argue that these lineages then rapidly expanded across Eurasia and later diversified in Southeast Asia and then expanded westward around 55 to 55,000, 50 to 55 to 50,000 years ago. So they just talk about how it went to Eurasia and stuff very, very early, right? It talks about those things and whatnot. So it was up there for a while in Eurasia. As we know, we found a lot of D groups, more in Syria, right? Found some more in Syria. So we found some in Arabia, some in Syria. They found some individual here, so individual, right? Who is he? He's a governor of Iran. So that should be of some interest for those that may be interested in that, right? Just to visually see what someone with a D group would look like, right? So a D2 or D0 sample was also found in this individual, right? In Yemen. This individual, take a look at his face. That's the tribe of D0. D1. That's the tribe. You see that? That's the tribe of D0 and D1, right? Let everyone take that in. If someone asks about D0 and D1, let them know that the information is not that hard to find, but it might not be what some people think that it is when they think that these groups are only African. So that man from Yemen right there is going to be your D0. So that's the tribe that they're from. So we did find them in some of the African Americans and Nigerians, and we found them in a lot of different lineages in Syria and Yemen. And that individual that you see right there, that is a minister of foreign affairs of Yemen. So isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? And obviously some different individuals in areas of connecting with India with these areas, which we had talked about before, with connecting with the BMAC culture and whatnot. But that's something that's important to know about, indeed. So yes, I hope that answered that question. Amen, family. Indeed, indeed, we must. There's no doubt. Amen, amen. That's right. Yeah, it may have, but that may have, Zondervan may have, but the likeliness of that may be a little less when you realize that he actually uses a lot of historical documents, and that many other documents and many other books, like we were just looking at that little video, right? We didn't finish because many other books also copy those historical documents, and they're not copying this exact book. They're actually realizing that the just like we went over that historical documents, that Africans and Negroes were different. That by the time of these things in the Middle Ages, Africans and Negroes were different because the Negroes were Jews. A lot of Negroes were actually Jews. A lot of them were those dark skinned groups of Jews, and that's what's important to know about. And that's why also is letting you know that Helm is not those Negroes. That's what they're putting here. But let's see a little more on it. So yeah, could be that's an interesting hypothetical look, right? So, but then we got to ask ourselves, is it though, right? Because if it's saying it's not those Negroes, then it most likely can't be influenced by that Hamitic idea, because that Hamitic idea is saying that all Africans or all dark-skinned people are Negroes or are Canaanites, because that African idea of every dark-skinned person is a Canaanite was a idea that came up time again. They're different. So we got Bible, right? We got the Young's dictionary, right? That's gonna give you some. There's others as well, right? That's gonna give you these things, but these are just gonna be what I say is a interesting example, a very interesting example of what we just read from those docs, right? Because that's what we was basically reading from those documents, is that difference between those individuals. But still again diving, this is what we had to know about some of those things. So that video was just a teaser of what I really want to show you. So let's get a little idea of the Egyptians, right? You can get an idea, right? They look like modern Negroes, right? So that you can see on some pictures how they look, right? Not saying all of them look like that, but a majority look like this. A high majority look like this. So they had a very similar, and it makes sense because they're in Africa. They're quite literally in Africa, and they're basically moving about and working in the fields of life, right? So they're living like that. But this was interesting about that is that when we actually look at some of those information, we can note some interesting things. Let me actually just read some interesting things. So they found some. They basically went to Egypt and unearthed 8 mummies that were about 3,000 years old, right? And they go back and they find out something interesting. They say a lot of people has assumed foreign invaders brought a lot of genetic ancestry into the region, right? And they say people expected that through time Egypt will become more European, right? But we see the exact opposite. So this is actually interesting because they actually start to know that Egypt becomes more black, right? Because more and more darker skinned people come there. As it even says, modern Egyptians, by comparison, share much more DNA with sub-Saharan Africans. Is what they say, right? So if we go over some of those papers that had let us know that a lot of Egypt, again, were filled with what, right? As some of those ancient writings in those ancient papers, right?
Here's a total covering of the ancient lands that they all cover.
Let's point it out. Let's point out again, real fast before we go. Let's point it out again. Where was the most Jews at? Based on 1,000 years of Jewish history, from the days of Alexander the Great to the Muslim conquest of it, let us know right off the bat that the land that next to Judea contained the largest number of Jews was Egypt. So why was Paul compared with an Egyptian? Why was Moses compared with an Egyptian? Why was his son called out of Egypt? Right? Let's get into a little bit of these things that's important. It shouldn't be any harder to explain what is a sub-Saharan African or what a sub-Saharan African looks like. So they talk about that Egypt had more connections later on with more of those said sub-Saharan Africans, right? So what's interesting is paintings. If we look at paintings of the 3rd, 4th century of Egypt, there's an interesting story that's said, and a German artist had painted something for us all to kind of take on and see what was basically the idea of what was happening in the areas of Egypt, what it must have felt like and looked like, right? If you you probably heard of this before, the martyrdom of Saint Maurice and the Theban Legion, right? Or the Theban Legion, how you say that, right? If you never heard of the event, let me just kind of illustrate this. And the reason it's important because the group that was there quickly became Jews. Now, what's interesting is that many of the groups in the areas of Samaria had moved and migrated into areas of Egypt. We had spoke about this when we spoke about the evidence of Messiah and how some of the Samaritans were in Egypt and they were basically getting into Gnosticism. But some of them with the areas of the Egypt with the Egyptians, some of them with the Egyptians had continued, right, to be Christians. So let me actually show real fast. That's kind of interesting with that on what happened with some of the Egyptian groups and whatnot. So show a little bit of this. So again, fair use.
Greece, Rome, border of Switzerland, and northern Italy. Maurice is the commanding officer of Egyptian soldiers known as the Theban Legion. Summoned from Egypt by Emperor Maximian, the Theban Legion marches to meet their foes, the Holy Lance at their standard. Maximian then issues a terrible order. The Christian Thebans must offer sacrifices to the emperor and the other Roman gods.
The Roman emperor was the head of state, the head of the empire, but also a religious figure. For a Christian to pay homage to such a figure then would have been an act of renouncing one's religion.
The Roman Empire at this time is undergoing a concerted effort to persecute Christianity.
Emboldened or perhaps inspired by the spear of Christ, Maurice and his men refuse Maximian's order, proclaiming that despite their loyalty to Rome, they are Christians first. Emperor Maximian is outraged. He orders the decimation of Maurice's army, the execution of every 10th man. The countryside soon flows with the blood of the Theban Legion, all going willingly to their deaths.
So have you ever heard of Saint Maurice, Theban Legion, right? It's interesting when you go into the depth of what was happening in the land of Egypt. Now notice, even in the History Channel, they know what they look like, right? They know what they had to look like in that time, right? In the areas of Egypt and all that, right? And these ones were actually, they went through a decimation. Now let's take a look at this artist's depiction of this event of Saint Maurice with the Theban Legion. Now it does paint a little different picture than that historical reference on the History Channel. It almost looks like the Romans were basically not wearing any armor or anything like that, but they're kind of reflecting something. Something's kind of reminding this German in the 1500s of something that looks very similar and very familiar to that event. And if you know about this event in the 1500s, there were Jews and Moors, right? And remember, why did that Jew get the reward Negro? Because he assisted with the Moors. And many of the Moors and the Jews looked the same. In fact, they dressed the same. And that's why when the time came of the Inquisition, the Jews had to wear a red cross on their garb. Why? Because to show their difference between the Moors that also wore black and the Jews that wore black. That's why many Jews, even the converts today, they wear black. You'll notice that they'll still wear black because that was actually something that they were doing with the Moors that were wearing black. It was something that was very even picked up by the Christians. A lot of Christians that start doing it wearing black. A lot of people start doing that. They start seeing black as a luxurious thing. But one of the interesting things about this event was that this event, also the individuals, the Roman individuals, came there to slay those Egyptians, and those Egyptians took off their armor and laid down their lives, pretty much. And the interesting picture here is that you'll notice something that this person feels in that time. Now, what does he feel when you think about this picture? Because one of the best things about artists is what they feel when they draw something. And if you notice something very special about this individual here, notice that this person is praying, but they're also smirking. So this is actually, and the way that they look is very interesting, right? But the way what's happening here is very interesting, that this person is praying, watching this, and smirking and kind of smiling, and others are praying as well, but you can kind of tell they're not thinking the same thing that that person is thinking. They're not thinking the same thing that a lot of these individuals are thinking, but they're kind of in a sense that this is happening, like this is kind of happening, and this is what's going forth. And you can kind of tell which ones are being slayed and which ones are not, which ones are be the ones that's going to be, and which ones are not going to be the ones slayed. So important to understand when looking back at some of these illustrations of these things, they kind of paint a very important picture to kind of know about of these. So it's very interesting. I'll just play a little bit of ending here to kind of show what happens at their end.
It's logical that he would also have what is one of the few military relics of the whole story of Christ.
As Christianity grows and the story of he spreads, the Lance's association with the founding stories of holy martyrdom enshroud it with divine power.
Back to the Greek word pharaon. Subsequent Christian iconography, Maurice is often portrayed as a black man.
All right, so it goes on, lets people know that story becomes inspiration, right? They hear about this Roman army that lays down their life, right? You can find it on Wiki or different places, right? Saint Maurice, right? Goes a little bit on it, right? Saint Maurice, right? Saint Maurice, right? Very interesting when going on to some of these things, right? Saint Maurice, right? Maurice. So very important to kind of go into a little bit of understanding there, right? We kind of go a little more into him because he got some very interesting background to him that kind of gives us some interesting parts of where he came from and what he was dealing with in that time and everything, and what had happened and the transition of those moments and everything. And again, right, there's a lot of individuals that were living in those areas, a lot of different individuals that will be living in those depicted areas. That will be a mixture of how we have seen all the way to the Muslim conquest, Jews in the areas of Egypt, right? So we kind of get a good idea of what they look like and everything on those things, right? So he would be a legion with them, but he was in Egypt, right? Different group. But others go into these things, and what happens is we start to see individuals start to kind of mess with images. And the problem with that, the reason why this is important, right? Someone asked me, why is it important that people learn their heritage and learn history? Why do we learn history in schools, right? We have to learn other heritages, right? But one of the biggest things is to know about how these stories had unfolded, to know about that these people who seem like they don't have much history to them, they have a deep history to them, right?
It was there.
And ties. But this is kind of like things like this. It's kind of dangerous. It starts it starts by taking away from what was going on. But this is just talking about the breakdown of it, the decimation, right? Killing every 10th man and whatnot, and it just goes over exactly what happened. But sometimes you got to be careful with the illustration of those things, right? Others went into this, right? Dawes camera action went into this here about the group of the Moors.
Until it winds up in the hands of a soldier named Maurice, fighting Rome and northern Italy.
So if you've never seen this little breakdown, this is important because a lot of people, they add history about the connection of the Moors, the Black Moors, right? That also had connections to groups of the Abrahamic religion, right? And things like that. So we have seen a lot of different connections. That's why you see groups of people settled in the Niger or the rivers of Niger, also called a Christian, right? Niger or Niger Black, right, are usually also Christians, because also Nubia were highly Christians. And what's important is a lot of Jews kept fleeing deeper into Egypt, deeper into Nubia, deeper into Africa. That's something that's important to understand with a lot of these groups, is that they would have a clear tie. So I'll put this note in the description afterwards. It's just uh, the information on true Jews. You can see pictures all the way from like 300 BC, even to that time frame of Maurice, right? How the Jews looked. Here's a picture of what they believe what the Jews look like. You can see right there is no small thing that we can see there. Their shirts are white, but their skin is bronze. So we can get a good understanding of what they look like. So, and we can go to kind of like some breakdowns of that illustrates those things for sure, like different breakdowns without a doubt. But again, remember how we talked about how Moses, Paul, right, other different individuals look like Egyptians, right? And we had spoke about how even Egyptians, like the time of Ramses II, which many called the Egyptian pharaoh during the time of the Exodus, they looked at his tomb, one of his tombs, and see like things of Egyptians and everything during the time of Moses, when they would have said Moses looked like an Egyptian and whatnot. This is what Egyptians would have looked like. They would have had curly hair. It looks like it's relaxed, right? But you can see the curls, right? Right there. Kind of get a more closer look. You can see the wavy hair, the curly hair, and everything. So you kind of get a good, interesting look at that, right? Most likely relaxed, because that was something that they were doing even back then. And they're darker skin, so their pigmentation is darker skin, and it's not, that shocking. That's the biggest thing about this history, is that it shouldn't be shocking, but the reason why it's important is because it gives people something that was removed, and a lot of people were upset because of problems that had happened. But we gotta, as believers, be patient and kind of give room for that distress, so that there can be a recovery here. So you can see, obviously, there's some bleaching going on with the hair. Look at his hair. If you know any person of African, or a person like an African, over Negroes and stuff like that, if you bleach their hair, it turns white, right? You could type it down, African hair or bleached hair of black people or whatnot, and their hair turns white, right? I know it's because my wife, she bleached her hair and it became like a whitish blonde, right? And that's what happens. So they obviously got decorations. They got their hands painted. She got earrings, right? This is Egypt, right? Coming into the Bronze Age, they're coming off of the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, right? They're going to transition to all that, and they're in a kind of advanced culture, and we can kind of see this very detailed tomb, what they look like. So we can get a good idea on what they look like. So she got some head design there, right? Some eye covering, probably some eyeliner on and everything. Like they all got eyeliner on, looks like. And you can see what's going on there. Some just got little bands on their head, right? But we can see some lights and some hair going on. Some with their whole hair shaven, right? So that's interesting to kind of get a look at. So again, what I was showing you, really, quite literally, a tomb, right? Actually, during the time of the Exodus, those groups look like. And apparently, again, I showed you a study that showed that as the Israelites moved into there and other groups, they became black, more darker. So it talks about how they was early 20 dynasty stuff. We can see what's going on there, whatnot. So early tomb of what the Egyptians look like. So we got a good understanding of what these Egyptians look like in those lands. But we start to see things called what I call whitewashing. What is whitewashing? A lot of people know what that is. It's a real thing. It happens a lot. If you can even see it happen with the Brazilian conquest when they was trying to do a thing called whitening, right? I spoke about this before. I'm not going to go too deep into it now, but I'm going to point it out. Right? Right here, racial whitening, right? I'm just going to Brazil was doing very controversial, but they was basically trying to change and basically the people's views, right? On basically change one's race, right? As a black or mixed race person raises in the class of structure in Brazil. So it's important to understand pretty much what's the best way to summarize this. It's pretty much something that they were trying to make the nation white. That's the best way I can summarize it. And they did a lot of history changing and stuff and different things like that. Like they'll have stuff like their solution to they say Negro problem and whatnot. It sounds like I'm playing around, but very serious. But this is what happens. That the early images, this is a depiction by the actual person that went to the tomb and has a book on this. But what happened was someone changed it. So you can notice that this individual becomes a little lighter skin, and individuals that were first skin start to become a little like almost like a darker pigmentation. But notice how darker they become here. Now they're much more darker, and now these are much more lighter. Notice something that's something that commonly happens is that there be white and real image of this one from the book Egyptian Weapon and or Warfare Weapons by Ian Saw, or how you say his name. This is actually where that would come from. So here's an example of the actual. But what will happen is these kind of outs that start to happen. So these are Egyptologists. So if you want to see the real illustration, it's from this Egyptologist, right? So here is it, the illustration. This is what I mean about whitening out. There's a lot of examples of this. There's quite a lot of examples of this. So here's the real book. So Egyptian Warfare and Weapons by the Egyptologist Ian Saw. So you can see right there, how does he look? You can get an easy idea of the separation. Which one is the original? This one is the original. This one is the original image, right? Take that in real fast. This is what whiting out is. This is what white out is. And then all of a sudden, you see these images circle around, right? These things are not accidents. These are on purpose. And then you start seeing these images circling around. There you go. Now you got an idea of how powerful imagery is in the influences of people's minds. Idea on why a lot of people battle for how these people, they would say they want them to look and whatnot. So you can see some of these different things. And yeah, we do see a lot of these alterations online. So these are things that pops up. But a lot of times they'll have the original image, but a lot of times they'll change that. That's something to know about. That a lot of times they'll have the original one, but a lot of times they'll change it. You can even see some Egyptian females. The Egyptian females, like this one right here. You can see her white garment right there. It's kind of sheer. So it's kind of sheer, but she has a crown on her head, right? And in fact, she is the mother of one individual. You can see her right here playing some game. Almost looks like chess, but it's a little different. But this is actually the tomb of I always say her name weird, Nefertiti, something like that. But the great wife, they say, of Ramses II. So during the time of the Exodus, right? So the females of Egypt, right? This is going to be very important to kind of get an understanding of how they looked and moved about. That's why when Moses ran about, that lady said, "An Egyptian helped me," right? He said, "An Egyptian helped me," right? Why did Moses, who was an Israelite, look like an Egyptian? Why did it look like an Egyptian was helping him, right? Is it because E1B1A? the groups of the Egyptians look just like the other Egyptians, and that E1B1A group would be more highly tied to the Semitic groups. That's probably what it is, to get a good understanding of what's going on here, looking at the full picture here. So another interesting thing about that is that, again, right, there's a lot of different examples, a lot of different evidences of certain things. But another interesting thing that I think is kind of important, let me just point it out over here, this part down here. I think it's important to kind of go back and remember that fact about the Negroes and stuff like that. I want you to hear something that's interesting, because we have spoke about the people of Elam, and I find Elam very interesting to go over. But this little book that talks about Nature Knows No Color Line, right? Research into the Negro ancestry and the white race, right? They actually go on and they have an interesting conversation. They say something that I think is kind of interesting when they talk about this part up here. It just says also in his research says that the Elamites who once dominated in that region were Negroes. So he talks about how the Elamites were Negroes. And it says one of their kings is mentioned in connection with Abraham in Genesis 4. So they go over and they talk about, obviously, some connections with Elam. We talked about that with the BMAC culture. We did a genetic study on the BMAC culture, on how the E1B1A was up there in that culture and in different that we've seen. For example, BMAC, right? Importance, right? On there, get the ties. And here we can go to studies of the BMAC culture, right? And what we'll know is that in the Bronze Age culture, there it is, E1B1A. So we can see there's an E1B1A there. So that's very important. Very, 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 very important to kind of take note of these things. All right, let's get this down. So that's why we're going over the actual false. We're going over the how the whitening out happens and how the images change. All right, go say. All right. So very, very important. Guys. Let's see. A little chunk. But that's not even everything I want to touch on here. Because remember, we was just talking about the Egyptians. So it's going to talk this interesting historical document and some very interesting information. So Starbo, 80 BC or BC, 30 BC, says the people of Western Judea were of part Egyptian ancestry. Hold on. Are we getting a good understanding of what is being said in the BC time frame? That we're hearing something interesting about the Jews, right? We're hearing something interesting about the Jews before it falls. That they have some Egyptian ancestry. Remember, we just seen genetic information saying they had sub-Saharan African ancestry, right? So that's very important. So very, 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 very important. So let's read a little more. But he says, although the inhabitants are mixed, many assert that the Jews are an Ethiopian race. So there's no mistake where Ethiopia is. He's not saying modern Ethiopia, or he's not saying Abyssinia. He's saying Ethiopia, which is under deep in Africa. So he's saying the Jews look black. What he's saying, blackface. So, and it goes on for Romans to have taken them for Ethiopians is clear indication of their color, since the Ethiopians were definitely black to the Romans, right? ancient. So it's very, very, very important. It also talks about ancient Jewish legends. It just says themselves recognized a Negro strand among the Jews. So it goes over a lot of these things where it talks about a lot of these different things and the combinations of the historical writings and everything. When it's talk about how these Jews looked, what they look like, and another one we gotta look at is the Portuguese Jews. So it says right here, it says he just says obviously just talks about obviously some of the Jews were black, but he says especially dark were the Jews of Spain and Portugal. The Portuguese Jews were very dark, right? So it says some of the witnesses of that time, right? And you can see some of the witnesses will write that indeed, as she said, the Jew, the Negro, and the Portuguese could be seen in a single person. So that's what we were talking about earlier, is that the Negro or the black Portuguese or the Jews are one peoples, right? So they're going to ultimately trace to one node. So they're related. So that's what, just like how it goes over, just like the Jews we were talking about that were sent to St. Thomas by King John. So I don't know if this goes on deeper into that, but this goes into it, right? Those Jews that were probably sent away, this probably just goes into it, that was sent by King John to St. Thomas, right? So it goes into those history. And they even go and talk about how in Africa they found some of those final high priests. And if you remember, there was only one high priest garment made. And what happened to the high priest garment? Why does a high priest garment look like this? What would happen to the high priest garment for it to look messed up like this? In the Gospels, in the book of Matthew, the high priest rips his garment, which is actually against the law. There's a law that says the high priest shall never rip his garment. But the high priest, because Messiah, he says, tell us, are you the son of God? When they have him at the Sanhedrin, and they say, tell us, are you the son of God? And basically Messiah speaks. The high priest takes his garment and rips it, tears it. So one side of the garment is teared and ripped, and there's only one of those made, right? And it has to be in one piece. The whole way that is made is special. You can't sew it on. You can't repair it. So he ripped it, and that's it. So not only did the city fall, but the garment ripped, and he still has the medallion on him, which is the ancient medallion of the 12 tribes. And they're using them. And if you know, they're using a lot of those ones in Africa to find those tribes, where those tribes were positioned, and bringing them back to the Negroes. And let's go a little more into that. So again, we're talking real sources, real information. That's talking real historical information, because a lot of those direct information we spoke of directly. So speaking of those Semitic groups and whatnot. But let's go a little bit, and that's kind of this kind of something that's like that, but a little different. So they got this report in New York, and this was interesting. This is an ancient report in New York, and it's talking about. Just gonna click this and kind of go to in the 19, right? So February 1800s, page 24, image 24. So it's gonna be an actual like flyer, right? Real magazine, whatnot. But it has something interesting on it that I think is kind of interesting just to kind of speak about that it has on it. And this is what it says: Negro Jew. All right. So it says from New York, right, and all that whatnot. It says it just talks about some things, and it says this about the contemporary, right, our esteemed contemporary, the American Hebrew, right? So it says the American Hebrew is what it says. Thinks it is time to stop the immigration of the African Hebrew. So you see what it's saying there? Saying it's time to stop the immigration of the African Hebrew, right? That newspaper had long supposed there was only one of him, but others are appearing in America with begging, right? Probably gonna say this one wrong, weird, because I can't tell if that's a L or a T. Pro, basically, just they're basically talk about that. They're talk about slowing down the development of it, pretty much. The newcomers are Negroes, so the newcomers are Negroes, but it is rather ambiguous to call them African Hebrews, For there are many thousands of African Hebrews of the pure Jewish race. Hold on. Let's hear what he's saying there. What's going on there? What is he saying there? So he says something really interesting that's kind of important to kind of pick up what he's saying here. And he's saying, right, very, very important on this little part right here, right? The newcomers are Negroes, but it is rather ambiguous to call them African Hebrews, just like it's kind of odd to say Hebrew Israelites, right? He just call them Israelites, right? Or call them Hebrews, right? But here it's saying, for there are many thousands of African Hebrews of the pure Jewish race. And not to go back to the time of the Jewish captivity in Egypt, thousands of Jews were settled along the north and east coast of Africa before the Arab invasion. Remember, didn't we just talk about that? We talk about the Arab invasion in 600 AD when the Arabs were pushing out the Jews and everything because the Jews didn't want to become Islamic, and we knew that most of the Jews of Israel were actually in Egypt, in Africa. Okay. So that's important. So it lets us know that, again, the Jews were settled along the north and east coast of Africa before the Arab invasion. A new item recently told of, you see what's saying here? What's going on when we talk about these things, when we talk about these Jewish settlements? So let's talk about the Jews of where? Where is it connecting it to? By a Jewish merchant of Timbuktu. So they're talking about a Jewish merchant of Timbuktu that's giving some information on these things. The term African Hebrew does not naturally suggest a gentleman of color. So very important, for most of them are as white people can be in the continent after living there for generations. So that's very important. So now we also got to understand something about this statement, about this combination of the African Jews, is that some of them can have a lighter tone. But let's also remember that there's Jews like the Jews of the Limba that still have a darker tone. And yet, if you look at the Limba groups careful, you got other groups among them, like the Rimba, right? The Vinda. And we actually will have to look at them carefully, like we had there before, and find out which ones are actually the real Jews, which ones have picked up the Jewish practice, because some of the Turkish groups actually moved down there into the areas of Africa. But notice something here. This is very, very interesting, very, very important to kind of take note of, because we're going to go a little bit more into what they're saying here, right? So very, very, very important. So there are not many Negro Hebrews in Africa. So you see what they're saying here? Though explorers have vouched for their presence in small numbers. So they say explorers did vouch that there are Hebrews that were Negroes in the areas of Africa. So that's important. That's important to understand. But you got to know, when people were being racist, they're kind of biased. They want those lighter Jews. That's what they want to find. They want to find those lighter Jews. But they're letting you know that they're also noting that some vouch that there were also darker Jews there. If we go a little more into it, we'll start to go into a little more into the understanding of these things. It says the lot of the Jews in the Mohammedan states of North Africa. So again, when the Moors have moved down there, as we see with movements of Islam, it says the lot of the Jews in Mohammedan states of Africa is not a happy one. A few of them escaped their tribulations by embracing Islam, but most of them, right, clinging with the greatest, pretty much, destruction, everything, and everything. They're trying to hold on to their pretty much their faith of their father. So a lot of them, as I said, those Jews were basically going through it, right? And that's going to be very, very, very important to understand that that's going to be some of the movements of them. But as you see, one of the major things to see right here is this right here. The reigning family of Morocco is partly Negro. So very important to kind of understand this. Slavery still exists in Morocco, and some of the Negroes imported from the Sudan fell among the Jewish populations. And I'm that can make out that's basically they're basically seen as the Negro is to his religious environment. So it's very important to know that these groups, right, will be dwelling around each other. But that word Negro, recently in the 1900s, they start to try to separate those groups that are Jews and start to separate them from who we already had processed through time that the Negroes were Jews, and a lot of them actually practice Judaism. So that's gonna be very important to know about. Let's see what exactly what Jews say early on. But we can also take a lesson from this guy, um, um, Leonard, was it Rogoff, right? He's gonna be basically a historian of the Jewish heritage. But we're gonna take a look at some ancient writing by a Israelite about some things. But I want you to first see this one, because he writes a little bit later on some of those articles, and he says, "Is the Jew white?" So he writes about, is the Jew white? So this is gonna be in 1910. So he says the racial place of the Southern Jew. So he's gonna write some interesting things here, and I want to read you something that's kind of interesting when we talk about some interesting stuff when he talks about descendants of Negroes and whatnot. But this is what he says: behind the Jew, a Negro. All right. So if you seen here, so this is just talk about the Negro Jew, and there was a lot of talk about Jews having ties with Negroes and all those different things and whatnot. It's a very controversial time. But as you can see right here, it says behind the Jew or Negro lay a century of transatlantic speculation on the racial status of the Jew. In the American South, the problem of the Jews' racial identity was a footnote to the larger debate on white black relations. So, why is Jews being part of white black relations? Watch what it says here. A question pushed forward in the racial unsettled period between, so that's why it was racially unsettled between the pretty much what is called the heightened knowledge that they had going on, or forgot how they word it, in the 1850s to 1915s. So that's going to be important to note of the heightened racial disagreements that were happening there. Because remember, chattel slavery left a big mark on people's mentalities, right? Jews were accepted as white, but their precise racial place was not fixed. So that's important. Why this is important? A long tradition of European folklore by an emergence of racial science cast the Jews on the black side of the color line. So that's important to know, is that they had other information and ancient information that actually said that by ancient Europeans moving around, they knew that the Jews were known as being blacks. But let's go a little more into something a little more pinpoint. So we can go over like different things, like a couple of different things, like how we got maps that talks about Jews in Africa and everything. Like this, where it says, according to this map, this was peopled by Jews. So that's something that's important. And that was in the 1400s, 1500s, like that, 1600s, 1700s. So this was an area that was peopled by Jews down there. So they would have some Jews down there. And now this was interesting about all that, is that when we got some of the ancient writings by some of the said rabbis around the areas, they write about their family lines. And this is what they say. These are going to be two of the same phrases. It also lets us know that Shem is like a dark and calmly, when Helm is going to be a little darker. So both of these are going to be dark skinned. Shem and Helm has some dark skinned individuals in them, right? But as I showed you with the DE group, they have that more Arabian look, right? So this is actually from, just gonna copy it here, or I'll just show you. This is from the 8th and 9th century, right? What I just showed you from that little writing from this said rabbi, right? Gonna be writing, right? And he's gonna be settling some of the areas, and he's gonna be basically talking about what's going on there. So he's gonna be technically, say, in the sense of a Israelite and whatnot. So you can get some different talks of them and whatnot. So that's gonna be what we just read there, where he's talking about. He's letting you know that they were dark, that the group was dark. So there's a lot of evidences of connections of groups that had developed together and would have a pigmentation very similar to those of the culture of the land. And it just so happens that there had come a time when there was a later invasion that people started to change up on who think is who, right? So that's something that's kind of important to take a note of what happens in a lot of these lineages and everything. Was something that is important to know by the roots of it all, right? So we can find the evidence of the roots, and we can find out what's going on here just by going over some things. So I'm gonna end it like this, and I'm gonna kind of give some interesting studies of some of the Jews or false finds of Jews that were found, and other things that were found in some interesting areas and whatnot. So I'm gonna just kind of point out some of these things that I think is kind of interesting. So remember, we had spoke about, obviously, the lands of Egypt may have gotten more African. Well, let me read you a little interesting article from some screenshot that I had saved from some information. So let me read this real fast. The relationship of, if you know about Linkish, let me actually put this here. There's actually not a lot of people know about this. Why I typed it like that. This place right here. Just kind of tell you why it's important about this place. This pinpoint place, out of all the places, the place that was besieged by the Neo-Assyrians. Why is that important? Because the biblical narrative contests of this. Jeremiah contests of this. The Sennacherib prism, which I don't know if this probably has it somewhere on here, the Sennacherib prism also contests of the event that's going to happen here. That this event is going to be a major event that's going to be the sieges of Assyria. So you can see right here, there it is, by the conquest of Sennacherib. So Sennacherib is going to be besieging this area until the rise of Nebuchadnezzar. And why is that important about that besieging? Because in this direct area, directly were Israelites, Jews were Israelites. So there, and what happened was the groups that were there, they were slaughtered, they were killed, and they basically settled in one of those areas. I can see Linkish, how you say that, emerged one of the most important cities of the Kingdom of Judea, right? Second only to Jerusalem. So that's going to be very important, because the individual that was making his way to Jerusalem, he passed through the city and besieged it. So it's going to be very important to kind of hear what is said about some of the results that they find there, right? The relationship of Linkish series may now be considered, right? All its closest connections are with series of the lower Egyptian type. What? Notice the groups in the area with the Judeans have ties to those lower Egyptian types. And these are close enough to suggest that the population in the Palestinian town was entirely or almost completely of Egyptian origin, right? So you see what is going on there, and what are they connecting to? the skeletal material from Lachish is believed to represent people who died about 700 BC, which is the time of the 25th dynasty of Egypt. See what's going on there? So you can see what's going on there. And yet they see that these groups have some connections to some of the groups that went into areas of Nubia, into areas of Egypt. So that's important because it's letting you know, just like we know, Israelites kept fleeing into the, as we know, with the biblical narrative, they kept fleeing into Egypt, settling and becoming strong in the middles of Egypt, right? Getting deeper in there, right? It's not everything's written down, but guess what? Genetics is starting to reveal a lot of these things, these ties. So that's what's important here is to take a look at how their connection is to these groups. They look at a lot of these groups. They look at the men and the women, and they look at how they're related. And you know what's interesting about how they're related? They look at some very interesting details on how their facial features look. And it's kind of interesting to kind of take a look at that, which we had spoke about some different hereditary connections. Here's another piece, right? Here's going to be another piece that I'm going to kind of read here, what's going on here. It just says right here when it talk about of those groups, the latter just talks about the ones at Lachish, right? Maintains a stronger Egyptian and Phoenician affinity with European and North African affinity secondary. So very, very important. Let's go a little deeper into what they're saying there, right? Let's go a little more deeper into these finds. So obviously they're getting those skeletons, right? They're looking at those skeletons and everything. They're looking at those bodies that were there, right? That's going to give us an understanding on who they have there and their connections to these groups, like we have seen with the Egyptians. As we can see right here, we can look at different connections. They just talk about obviously contributions from the Mediterranean, Egyptian, and Nubian groups, or whatnot. When they talk about the ones in southern Levant and Lachish, right? All that. Let's get a little more deeper into it real fast because this is kind of working its way to what I want to show here. So this is just going to be some physical designs by the Assyrians, how the Israelites kind of Afro-Asiatic. Obviously, Hebrew is from Afro-Asiatic, so Semitic groups are Asiatic. So they got some heads or something right there. You can kind of see on there, right? Braided hair, dreads, right? Kind of thick noses, right? And right, we can go into a lot of deep information onto it. Quite interesting to know that we can find evidence of connections of Israel and who they are genetically connected to. So this is a study of the population continuity or replacement in ancient Lachish, right? It's going to talk about those connections of those groups. And it just gets interesting stuff. There's a lot of interesting information on this.
History shows that both Amos and Micah's dire prophecies seem to have come true. The kingdom of Assyria invades Israel in 722 BC and destroys Samaria, its capital, less than 40 years after Amos's prophecy.
In 722 BC, the Assyrian Empire conquered the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom of Israel and scattered them to the winds. Isaiah warned the people of Judea that their kingdom would be next if they did not confront their shortcomings and embrace compassion.
Up them on sharpened poles. They would make pyramids of heads and pile them up at the entryway of the city.
And now, a new transition for the Israelites' vision of God about to occur. It would come when the great empire of Babylon conquers the Israelites and forces them into exile. Within this turmoil, God would finally move beyond the struggle. In 586 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon conquers Jerusalem, destroys the city, and deports most of the people. Throughout history, God always been tied to a particular.
So you got a good understanding of what it's saying here, that these images that I'm showing you, these are real Israelites, right? But let's kind of go over something that I think is important to understand. Again, watch what it says here of those groups. When it's looking at those skulls that we were just talking about, right? In those caves at Linkish, watch what it says here. After looking at the study of it, he concluded that the collection was largely heterogeneous. So I get that weird, saying it weird on my tongue. Having close affinity to North African, Egyptian, and Nubian groups, thus claiming the Linkish collection to have an Egypto-Nubian presence. That means that the Israelites had partial connections to those groups that became Negroes. That's very important. So it's giving us some understanding of those groups, of the groups of Linkish, right? Let us know they are going to be highly connected with groups that actually would show ties to groups that are Negroes. Now let's also understand that it gets deeper. There's more information that gets deeper into this, that puts these things together without a doubt. That's why we had to look at this carefully, because we did find Israelites, right? So they're looking at indeed the dental, those things. And remember, we even come to Natufians, which was great, because as it says right here, right? It just says the traits and whatnot at Lachish were compared with pretty much with Jerusalem, Monastery, Iron Age, Italy. It says a Natufian group, right? And whatnot. And when we went over some of the information on how those groups were connected and everything, right? We're talking about how those groups were highly connected, right? Proto with Proto-Semitic groups, but also ancient ties to ancient Israelites. So Israelites. So here's the Sennacherib prism, right? This is the real Sennacherib prism. That word for word, right? Just like the biblical narrative says that this event happened, the Sennacherib prism, word for word, says this happened. The word for word tells us that this event happened, right? Here's just a small example of it, right? Flee when these upper nations, these northern nations, was trying them. They were trying to flee.
Hezekiah the Judahite, who did not.
This is prism. They literally talk about Hezekiah of Judah. This is insane. This is the truth, right?
Submit to my yoke. 46 strong-walled cities, as well as the small territory which were without number, by leveling with battering rams, and by bringing up siege engines, and by attacking and storming on foot. By mines, tunnels, and breaches I besieged and took them. From King Sennacherib's prism, dated 689 BCE. Now it came to pass in the 14th year of King Hezekiah that Sennacherib, king of Assyria, came up against all the fortified cities of Judah and took them. Isaiah 36:1. During the third campaign of King Sennacherib, his Assyrian army swept out of the capital to capture or subjugate all of the Phoenician coast, Philistia, and Egypt, including kingdoms of Judea.
And look at that. Look at how Assyria came down. It's important to know there's Lachish. And guess what? They kept fleeing to Egypt. The people kept fleeing not upwards. They were fleeing deeper into Egypt.
Triumphs are recounted in the biblical passages of Isaiah and repeated on Sennacherib's monuments. Palace.
There's right there. There's a place. So it's witnessed by the Bible and by the Sennacherib prism. So that's very interesting when we take this whole thing into consideration. That's why when people look at it, they can actually, even from these groups that leave from those Assyrian groups, they can start to connect the Semitic African groups together, or those groups that become those Bantu groups or Asu and different things like that, right? Different combinations of groups that start to come together. That I never really broke this down, but maybe we should go real fast as we're just going to stuff. So just for those, that's how I ran this random information. I'm going to show you some stuff that people are talking. So here's an interesting one of the tribe of Judah in Africa, right? This one's really deep because it actually goes over some of the rare history, right? Just to get to like the history of the groups that go into Africa, right? They bring out some of the interesting comfort. What's the word I'm looking for? What's the word I'm looking for? It's a lot of people can't handle it. Is what's happening with some of the things that happens with some of these writings, but they're truths. They're truth because they're verified by historical records. But it has to do with the growth of certain groups in Africa that grows into what's the word I'm looking for? Actually, Israelite communities. That a lot of them are bloodline Israelites, but not a lot of them actually stay committed to the Israelite belief. That's what's important to know, as well, with a lot of the movements of these groups. But so this one, I'm not gonna play, but I just want to show a little bit of this one because this actually is something that's kind of interesting. That it talks about origins of groups and how they're connected to Semitic groups and whatnot, right? So connecting Assyrians, Egyptians, and Nubians alike to kind of put them together. I say that right now, but I just want to show a piece of that because that's what this event was showing, right? You can kind of take a look at them and tell or the African features to them, so you can see they're carrying their heads. Kind of tell with them here. They're kind of moving up, right? Syrians besieging them, and they're being besieged, and they're being captive, right? They're being taken captive until later on they're gathered until they're captivity again into the captivity again to the Messiah come, and then no gathering of them when it's all finished, all said and done, right? So I just wanted to show that because that's one of those pieces. It goes deeper. There are papers that talk about how exactly the females looked, how Leroy and different things like that. We have spoke about recently and before. Very interesting stuff that I think is worth going over. So some small highlights, little tiny highlights that I think set some understandings on things, right? So that these some small things that I think is very important to understand. So this just quickly the siege that is also spoken of in the Bible and everything, and it was pretty horrible, right? The king of Assyria at Lachish, right? Also with Hezekiah, right? Hezekiah was there with Sennacherib and all that. But those Israelites, those Jews, were Negroids. Were Negroid. They were highly related to the ones of the 25th dynasty that also has connections to the Nubians, and that's why we had pointed out that they had connections to Nubians, and that's going to be kind of interesting to point out that that's kind of that said African mixture. So that's why they look like that. That's why they look fairly like the Africans and whatnot. But if any other so we can touch on some things. If someone's kind of, you kind of got like an idea of these things, maybe you want to get some insight on something, or you want to throw something out there, let me know and whatnot. Amen. That's great. That's why we want to go over this, because it may be something that others know, but it may be new to someone else, right? It may be new to someone else, right? There it is. Dolichocephatic skulls versus the brachiocephatic skulls. Exactly. That's quite important. That's quite important because that's what the Jews had. That's important. That's important. That's also the ones at that place that we found. It just hopefully you're all right there. Right. All right. So at the peak, at the fullness and the peak of these things, I want to end it on one more piece of information. So let me make sure I got all the tabs that when not it's kind of like methodology, and I want you to have the sources that we're just talking random stuff. I can talk to an atheist for an hour and make them say, I'll consider having another conversation, or I'll consider going over this information, because we're not talking random stuff that's only to a small group of people. We're talking that can convince scholars because of the information actually real. It's real. The only problem is it's overlooked. The information is overlooked or underlooked, either or. It's one of those things that it needs some support. Like the information needs some support so that people who are claiming this heritage can have their heritage and not just be set as, oh, you never had any historical ties to these things. But actually the picture shows that they might have the closest ties to these things. That some of those groups have the closest ties to these things, those African groups. Because when did Israel even go into Europe? Right? No time in the Bronze Age. And if it was in the Iron Age, it was late Iron Age, like the time of when they went into the eras of Persia, Greeks. So that's something that's important to know. But they were um, separate from the groups that we know are Greeks, because we can verify who are Greeks and all those groups in the past. But because I want to show one more little piece. If not, that's all right, because it's just pretty much a saying. And the saying is this. I'll just say it, right? The saying is this: if you look at the full picture of who are actually the people of the Jews, original mixture at their origin, beginning, right? Else here and kind of pointing out how those groups had connections with Africa and everything. But let me point out real fast one thing that I think is on this. No, it's not on this one. Let's see if this thing opens up. If not, I'm just gonna close it. It's not. It's not. But that's pretty much, most of that is pretty much what I wanted to conclude, is that there's actually quite evidence that not only ties the people by their skin tone throughout all time to Egyptians. Also, genetic information shows that the Jews in Lachish, or the early ancient Jews, were highly related to groups that were ties with Egypt and Nubia. And that's very important to understand, is that sub-Saharan African increased in Egypt, which actually a lot of Jews increased in Egypt. And that's something that shouldn't be surprising, right? That's something that shouldn't be too surprising, right? Because many of the Israelites were actually seeming like they were, in a way, African. So that's something that's important to know. So with that, family, all I got for now, nothing much other than that. So that place is where they found, yep, that's interesting. It's also a place where they found the Epic of Gilgamesh. That's interesting. Indeed, indeed. Let me open up another tab. Let me try to open up, because sometimes tabs get off field, as you see, and then I gotta do something. Let me actually see if I can open this up. I want to show you this last. It's a conversation having that the Jews, right? The Jews, they have the Negroes, and we can prove it. We can prove it without a doubt, right? And again, they can pick up any tone by depending on the women that they mix with, right? They mix with Canaanites, they mix with Phoenicians, they mix with Cushites, they mix with all types of different groups. And obviously by the Middle Ages, mixed with that, so his father is Greek. So we one of the individuals, Timothy. Illustration. I don't know if it's not working there. Why this isn't even working. It's probably because I'm going to bring out something deep. This happens at times. But just saying it has some connection issues, but it looks like no, I'm seeing no issue. But let me try one more time on this to pull this one out. If I could. It seems like after I start going, and I can use this thing as long as I want, and it'd be fine. As soon as I get online, start throwing out some sources, start getting heated. Like, well, stuff starts slowing down. But let me just verify everything with what we just have here, right? Summary. Our conclusion is that ancient sources, ancient information, ancient genetics, ancient literature, obviously the linguistic connections with all these things show that the Hebrews had to be a southern culture that would have early Bronze Age and Iron Age ties to Africa. As we see, they also have connections to the Egyptians and also to that would be in those areas. They have fairly similar looks to them, and we got to be careful of whitening out when things are whitening out. So, original image versus the altered images that start the time. Those are happen of events in time, right? So those are real things that can happen and take off, right? It's just another piece on what I'm saying here on that. Maybe I gotta close some of these tabs or something.
On ancient Egypt. Now I want you to listen to this very carefully. After many years, more than 2 centuries in which European universities and academics have stated that Egypt is Caucasoid, or it is Semitic or Hamitic or Afro-Semitic or Afro-Hamitic, eventually they invited Sheikh Anta Diop and Theophilo Benga. This is the first time at any international conference on an intellectual matter that Africans are invited up to deal with their own story. Theophile Obenga, he wrote me last week. This is the first time I'm hearing from him, because apparently Diop left a lot of papers after he died, and so several people in France and French-speaking Africa suddenly become aware of the journal for the first time. Theophile Obenga is an expert on Bantu. He's head of the Bantu Research Institute in Brazzaville. He's a great linguist, like Diop. And they appeared at this conference. Everybody else was European or Arab from the Arab Republic of Egypt. And at this conference, everybody came prepared except Africans. Could you imagine that? This is a conference meeting, an meeting to discuss peopling of Egypt, and these guys arrive empty-handed, talking. The Africans arrive with heavily researched papers. The linguistic evidence of Diop was so startling that everyone had to admit this is one of the revolutionary things that Diop and Diop had proven beyond the shadow of a doubt, that the Egyptian language was not Semitic or Hamitic, it was African. But there is where the agreement ended, because when Diop tried to show that not only the language was African, but that the people were African, everybody got upset. And those people who couldn't say it is not so, they said we mustn't talk about race anymore. We are all human beings here. Let's stop talking about race. So let me read you the passage from my introduction which deals with this. A summary of this conference is of interest and value to read since it reveals Egyptology at the moment and the deflection to the question of blacks or Negroness. Professor Galab of the Arab Republic of Egypt declared that the human race during the Paleolithic era, which is the Stone Age, was more or less homogeneous and Caucasian, meaning to say all human beings were first white. This is an Egyptian, you know. And that Negroes only began to appear much later. A Negro culture, he claimed, did not appear prior to the Neolithic, that is the age of agriculture. Professor Di Bono of Malta spoke of a race of pyramid builders coming into Egypt, a race with Libico-Asiatic affinities, without even deeming it necessary to show where on this earth stands the proto-pyramid that this race constructed before it migrated to Africa. How could you have a race of pyramid builders who never built pyramids? Several participants, finding it difficult to demolish the up, decided instead to demolish all talk about race. Professor Saf Soderberg of Sweden, while demonstrating that the majority of Neolithic cultures in the Nile Valley belong to techno-complex of Saharan and Sudanic cultures, said the concept of race was outmoded and should now be abandoned. After he showed that the technology of the early Egyptians is Sudanic and Saharan, which is African, he said, don't talk about race.
So it's quite important. That's how another piece, how we verify. A lot of people have been verifying that these Egyptians were of a Negroid race and that those Israelites just looked like them. And that also the genetics of the groups of, again, those Jews have genetic ties to those Egyptians and the Nubians. So we know that later on, by the time that the Israelites were in the time of Messiah's time, right? After the transition of the AD BC, right? All that. We know that by that time, Egypt was more darker skinned and that they were comparing those, again, like Paul, comparing him to Egyptians, and not just comparing them to Egyptians, but also comparing the Israelites to Ethiopians. So that's quite important to know a little bit of those things. So right now, that's all I have now. I wanted to bring out a paper or a video of a historian that tells you that certain individuals of Goa knew that Jews were going into Africa, to deep areas of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll leave it like that for now. That's one of those things. But obviously, if anyone got anything else they want to throw out real fast, we can touch on something. Say, and man, family, as always, gotta keep those receipts because people are gonna be asking for them. They're gonna ask for them, right? As it put, that's right. You have left black and returned white. You are imposters and shall never see peace. Isn't that something? And that's one of the biggest things. That's why the scripture says, Jacob's face shall not now wax pale. So very important to understand that. That is exactly because salvation. And why not, right? Doesn't that sound like a poetic justice that somehow these people are chattel slavery and now find out that these were indeed the people, just like it says in Ezekiel 39, right? Read those last verses in Ezekiel 39, right? Then they say that God said he going to show the world that indeed Israel was in captivity, right? He's going to reveal it to the world that Israel was in a captivity, and how interesting that it was a chattel captivity that also caused a great diversion, I would say, a great controversy is what I would say. So the evil ones are always trying to stop this information, but we're gonna come back with more. Anyone who knows what we do, this was not even the tip of the iceberg of the receipts that we get of all the ancient historical information and genetic information. But with that, family, may this be one to remember. If you haven't seen it yet, right? I had a conversation with Jay Jump or it's saying J jump. T jump, right? I had a conversation on T jump. You can type it down on YouTube, right? T jump, and you could probably find a video. I'm gonna be uploading if you type down, right? Evidence of Hebrew Israelite. Very, very interesting. So with that, may you be blessed, may you be beloved, and amen, family.